Hey, good morning, Adrian. How are you today?
Good morning, Pete. Fine, thank you. Lovely
Good.
sunny day, so hopefully we'll have some good light and some heat at last in this slightly cold and wet and damp country.
Yeah, indeed. I'm looking out the window, the sun's shining brightly. I spent 45 minutes walking the dogs this morning, so I've even got a slight sheen on my forehead.
Excellent. Good stuff. Well, today I think we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about NIST, certainly. And I think the other item for the agenda is also talking and enlightening our viewers and listeners on cyber essentials. So I think we'll certainly kick off from where we left last time and have a bit of a more in-depth look at NIST. So I think let's start on that one and see how we get on.
Okay, great. So for those of you who don't know, NIST is a US government entity. It's NIST.gov. And the framework that we were referring to and that I'm going to talk about today is called their Cybersecurity framework. And it forms the basis for a lot of organizations' current view on cyber resilience. It has 5 pillars if you draw it in a left to right diagram, but I prefer the cyclical one because it is a cycle and it's important to understand the feedback of that cycle. So anyway, the 5 elements are these: identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And I think when this first appeared, and I believe the first time I encountered it, I was looking at the ISF website, and they started promoting cyber resilience in 2011. So here we are 11 years later, and still lots of people don't know what it's about. The idea is this, that historically, when we talked about, well, originally, I guess, IT security, then information security, then cyber security, the focus for the majority of people, both vendors and users, was defense. And I think still today, if you talk to the man in the street or the small business owner, or probably the medium-sized business owner, you'll find that that's what they think of. They think about what they believe to be defensive controls, things like firewalls, antivirus, passwords, although they're not all defensive controls, that's what they think they are. But
isn't that a slight misconception? I think we sort of covered this a little bit last time, in the fact that do a lot of certainly small and medium-sized business owners think that NIST is far too big for them?
Yes, I suppose they do, and yet it's only a fraction of what they need to be thinking about, and there's the challenge, really, because these days, as you and I know intimately, and much of our audience will understand as well, the sort of attacks we suffer used to be called advanced persistent threats, but now are just run-of-the-mill normal attacks, the most popular, if you like, in the criminal community, and the one we discussed a bit last time, I think, as well as ransomware, which once it's on your system is indeed persistent and typically is controlled remotely. And that's kind of the original definition of an APT. Now that's run of the mill. And the important learning point, the single learning point from this is no matter how good your defenses are, you will at some point get breached. And so you must have a strategy and the supporting processes to help you recover efficiently and with minimal loss from that inevitable breach. And it's that shift in mindset from I can defend my organization from the threats on the internet to I can defend my organization from a lot of threats on the internet, but inevitably at some point I will have some sort of cybersecurity problem, and I need to have a strategy not only to recover from that, but earlier on to detect it as soon as possible and to respond efficiently to that detection so that I can minimize the impact on my business, whether that's financial or even more commonly reputational damage.
So it's not just for IT people?
No.
Absolutely not. No. And I think this is what we see a lot when we come in to talk to senior management teams or executive boards, or even other stakeholders, including trustees, when we're talking about charities or larger multi-academy trusts, certainly, that some of Ascot London are dealing with these days. When you're talking about that whole risk and management of that risk around cyber. So there have been some quite interesting changes in both, from what I've seen on both the charities and the school side of things in these recent years, and especially with what's called their insurance schemes around the schools, especially which is called, I believe, the RPA scheme. And recently a lot more has come out in terms of the cover that schools can automatically get under those schemes. And I'm sure, I think we'll save that for another session, but there's some interesting topics around that, and especially the risk side of things of cyber. Okay, sticking on the NIST subject a minute. So what do you see with, I mean, because it is a relatively couple of decades old, well, certainly more than a decade old framework now. What do you see with the issues of NIST in its current guise in 2022?
I think that there's nothing that I can see wrong with the framework. It's people's attempt to implement it, of course. And when you first, and I suppose to some degree comprehending it, that first stage, that identify stage, is a lot of work for many businesses, or they believe it to be. And if they were to start looking at this, they maybe think, this is an awful lot of work. I'm not sure I can really go down this route. Maybe I'm better just burying my head in the sand. But the truth of the matter is, you need to not only understand what sort of threats you may be facing. I don't mean you become a techie, but you need to understand who's interested at getting your information, why they're interested at getting at it, and obviously then from that can flow what you might be able to do to prevent or mitigate it. And that's just step one. The other part of that identify phase is, what is it that they're after? What information do I have in my organization that someone might be interested in? And how could it affect my business if it were to get exposed to the public, or destroyed, or encrypted, or just altered in some way? And that discovery phase, if you like, is so critical. And most businesses just haven't done it, don't have an information asset register, which means they don't know really in detail what underpins the efficient running and growth of their business. So it makes it very difficult for them to put the money and the effort in the right place to protect those essential information components of their business. So that's the first big hurdle. It's much easier to go out and buy the apocryphal silver bullet. Yeah, I'm going to buy this wonderful firewall, I'm going to buy this amazing managed service provision, and all will be well. And they maybe don't really think about the fact that the information their business hinges upon can sit obviously these days in the cloud. It may be in multiple cloud providers. It's also on premise. It's also in their employees' endpoint devices, and it's also in their employees' heads. So to really do that initial inventory, if you will, and to then map that against the threats that are most likely to affect your business is a reasonably large project, but once done, provides the whole underpinning of a good cyber resilience strategy, and allows the business to spend money where it needs to, not only on defending that information, but on detecting intrusions towards that information and being able to ring the alarm bell quickly and to minimize the damage before it becomes threatening to the very existence of the organization.
Yeah, so really rounding up that first section, and certainly the first couple of pillars of NIST in that essence really is, and this is what we try and get across the boards a lot these days is the initial phase of it is just knowing your business and knowing what data and what information is essential to your business effectively, and to be able to assess your own risks before even looking at it from an IT perspective is exactly where you need to start with these processes.
Yeah, that's it's a good logical engineering scientific approach, but isn't something that's particularly well presented, if at all, by many of the vendors whose objective is to sell software, hardware, and services. And yet, if you follow this path, if you do these things correctly, you're actually much more likely to select some really high quality partners to help you implement the strategy, particularly if you're a small to medium sized organization. How many businesses can afford to employ 18 or 20 cybersecurity professionals in their own operations center, who would be able to monitor for problems 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, to respond to those problems, to isolate the attack, and all the other things that a good SOC does. But the majority of organizations can't or won't invest in that. So they do need a good professional managed service partner to provide that service for them. And the only way they're going to be able to select one that will do the job for them is to understand what they need for their business, which will be particular to their sector and indeed to their organization itself, and to make sure that that MSP can deliver those services efficiently and reliably. Once it's outsourced, then great, everything feels lovely, apart from obviously some regular tests and audits, but it's getting ready for that. It's understanding what you need, what needs protecting, and how to protect it. That is the initial hurdle. I think the big barrier for any business to adopt a proper cyber resilience strategy rather than just throwing money and resources at the wall.
Yeah, and of course, when you're talking about the NIST framework, it does also nice and neatly fit in with some of those bigger standards, and you talk about certifications, things like ISO 27001, very very neatly. But how does that also fit with smaller style standards, things like Cyber Essentials?
Well, Cyber Essentials is a reasonably good starting place in my opinion. I just had a quick look at the IASME site, that's iasme.co.uk, to understand where Cyber Essentials and Cyber Essentials Plus sits. And from a quick look, it appears to be exactly as it was several years ago when I first got involved with it. I think the baseline, it's a self-certification questionnaire, and that means being honest with yourself. Working through that questionnaire will make you think about many of the questions you should be thinking about if you were deploying a cyber resilience strategy based around the NIST framework. The danger, from my point of view, is if the senior executives or the board or the owner of the business believes that getting a tick in each of those boxes means that that's all they need to do, everything's tickety-boo, they're all safe and secure. It's really just a minimal baseline, if you will. And the Cyber Essentials Plus has obviously an audit CAM penetration test element to it. So there is some validation by the provider of the certification that you're telling the truth, that the systems are what you claim they are and are adequately secure. But my experience of working with that audit is that it's okay, but it's like many of these things, a bit too small, a bit too narrow, and a bit lopsided. And it doesn't really look at the more important issues that we just talked about, like detection and response. It's much more about prevention and protective controls, and that's fine. But it's only the first rung on the ladder, I think.
So for the sake of clarity for our viewers and listeners, certainly the Cyber Essentials scheme is certainly a UK government launch scheme. I believe it's only valid within the UK. Am I correct in assuming that?
As far as I know, yeah.
Yeah. But it has been reformed over recent years. Certainly its governing body now, I think, is IASME in this iteration. And there certainly are some increased measures that they've added into the, as you refer to it, tick box exercise of the Cyber Essentials portion of the standard. But the Cyber Essentials Plus, now, again, there are certain external tests, including penetration testing, some of which is performed within that iteration of that. How do you see that changing moving forward, and which steps? So it's a two-pronged question, really. Which steps would you see that you need to perform after, maybe even passing Cyber Essentials and Cyber Essentials Plus?
Well, in my ideal world, I would be saying to a business, go for Cyber Essentials and Cyber Essentials Plus if those certifications assist you in moving your business forward. That would be my first point. If you're doing business with UK government, then I believe it's pretty much a prerequisite now. If you're in a business to business, or even more importantly, business to consumer environment, it may have no perceived value to your customers. And if that's the case, then okay, it's a degree of a measure, but personally, being the rebel that I am, I would prefer to expect the business to develop a strategy that far exceeds what's listed in the Cyber Essentials checklists, and to tailor their requirements to their particular business and business sector. If you're in the hospitality industry, your requirements are going to be wildly different than if you're in manufacturing or if you're in finance or insurance. And I'm not just talking about what regulatory frameworks may be imposed on you, which we'd obviously see in the finance and insurance sector, but actually where your information sits, how it's used, how it's deployed, and of course, how it's protected will vary dramatically from sector to sector. You know, you think about the hospitality industry as a, for instance, you've got frontline workers who by their very nature are not going to be efficiently using authentication protocols to gain access to information and to record transactions. It's just not practical. If you look at the manufacturing industry, anything to do with IT and manufacturing will tell you that availability comes first and that confidentiality comes last, because everything's about keeping the systems running. So, you know, every business and every sector is different. I have an underlying objection to trying to apply any sort of framework across the board. Much better, I think, to deploy someone who understands how to do a threat and risk assessment for your business, how to identify the key information without which your business won't function properly, and then to put together a program of improvement or indeed creation of controls to protect and to detect attacks, and then a program of audits and testing to make sure that those controls are working. And of course, underpinning it all, a program of education to help your staff become more and more cyber aware, or as ISF called it, I think, raise their cyber IQ, heaven help us, and basically make people more intuitively able to defend the business. So that was not the answer that maybe you wanted, sorry, but it's a usual Pete ramble.
No, it's good. It's a really great perspective, but I think what's most important to take away from that is that all of these essentials are a good starting point. And from these starting points, it isn't just a tick box exercise. So to all of our viewers, all of our people who are in business, schools, charities, any organization, please do not use it as a tick box exercise, but use it as a starting point to ensure that both your risks are identified, and then as you're working through the process into as Pete was saying earlier, more managed service provision, or services or hardware even that is helping you to perform that sort of defense and prevention strategy, but continue that process. It doesn't stop there. It's also about things like your information governance, how your information within those systems is controlled. And that is no different, seeing as things have moved away from on-premise so much these days to a more cloud-based platform. Some people are moving back away from that. Some people have very mixed modes in terms of both a bit of on-premise and a bit of cloud. But I think what needs to be tackled a lot more, and again, this falls outside of the frameworks and falls more back into the risk side of things and people identifying their right risks, is that whole remote working piece, which again we have talked about briefly before, and I'm sure it's something that will come up again in our better conversations.
Yeah.
That's very helpful today, Pete. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Adrian. It's a delight as always. And perhaps next time we can talk a little bit more about that whole threat and risk issue and how businesses can get to grips with that as a starting point.
Excellent. Sounds like a good third episode.
All right. Thanks, my friend. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.